Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about chapter 10, how to measure a nation's income. So in this chapter there are three important questions for us to answer. The first one is, what does GDP tell us about economy? Okay, so in this chapter GDP will be the center, okay? So we will learn GDP. And then how is GDP computed? Then for the last question, we would like to learn what are some shortcomings about GDP data, some drawbacks about GDP, okay? So those are some important things that you will learn in this chapter. Now let's look at the first part. In chapter 10, we begin our macroeconomic learning, right? So there are some macroeconomic news that you might always see either in their social media or also in the newspaper. So for first one could be the COVID-19 pandemic created global economic recession that started at the first quarter of 2020. Okay, so this is what we call a macroeconomic news because it's about the global economic recession. Then in the United States, the output fell by 10.2% in the first and second quarter of 2020. The unemployment rate skyrocketed from 3.5% in February 2020 to 14.7% in just 2 months. So this news also a macroeconomic news because they talk about the whole U.S. output and they also talk about the unemployment rate. Next, the news talk about the prices in United States climb up at the highest rate since 1981, rising 8.5% over the year to the end of March 2020. So you can see at the last macroeconomic news, it talk about the U.S. inflation, right? So those are the typical macroeconomic news. Then let's look at some typical macroeconomic questions. In 1960, okay, South Korea has an income has an income per capita of $1,164, $1,154, okay? And Philippines has an income per capita of $691. So from here you can see in 1960, South Korea's income per capita was 1.67 times higher than that of the Philippines. Okay. 50 years later in 2011, we have the South Korea has an income per capita of $16,684. Philippines, okay, has an income per capita of $1,473. So here in 2011, South Korea's income per capita now is 11 times higher than Philippines. So you might think about some questions in macroeconomy view. Okay, so for example, what went right in South Korea? Anything right in South Korea? What might be went wrong in Philippines? Okay, so those are the very typical macroeconomic questions to talk about how the economic growth or recessions. Okay, something like that. Now, in this chapter, we will learn how to measure the nation's income, right? So GDP will be the indicator that we use to measure a nation's income. So let's first look at the definition. GDP, gross domestic product. It means the market value of all final goods and services produced in a nation within a specific period of time. Okay, so it is the sum of the output from all economic activities in a nation. So we would like to say the output value will equal GDP and GDP will also equal income. I would like to show you this later, okay? Now, we would like to say income will also equal expenditure. So first we have from previous slides, we have the output will equal GDP, right? Equal income. And here in this slides, I also told you income will equal expenditure. Okay. So now we have output will equal GDP equal income equal let's put output value, okay, and expenditure. So gross domestic product, GDP, measures the total income of everyone in economy. And GDP also measures the total expenditures on economy's output of goods and services. So you might see from the latest slides I use G and S, okay, represents for goods and services. So here for the economy as a whole, okay, just think about the economy as a whole. Then income will equal expenditure. Why? Because every dollars a buyer spend, this is expenditure, right, will become the income for a seller. So this is why we say income will equal expenditure. And now we will use a circular flow diagram to show you how income will equal expenditure, okay? So this circular flow diagram is a very simple description of the macroeconomy, and it will illustrate GDP as a spending, revenue, factor of payments, and income. So it will illustrate GDP for different perspectives. There are two preliminaries we need to learn before we move on to this diagram. The first one will be factors of production. So what is factors of production? So factors of production are the inputs that we use in production, such as labor, land, capital, etc. Okay? And another one will be factor payments. So factor payments will be just the payments to the factors of production. So for example, if I hire a worker, I need to pay wage. Okay, so wage will be the factor payment. If I rent a land, okay, I need to pay the rent, right? So rents will also the factor payments. Now let's look at how the circular diagram will work. You can see for the circular diagram, it has two parts. The first one will be households. Okay, so households and firms. So these two are the two participants in this diagram. Households, they own the factors of production. Okay, so for example, households, they can be hired by the firms, right? So households can offer labor. Households will have land that can rent to the firms. Household will have capitals that can also be borrowed by firms. Okay, so we would say the households, they own the factors of production, and they can sell or rent those factors of productions for incomes. And on the other hand, households will also buy and consume goods and services. For firms, on the contrary, okay, firms will buy or hire the factors of production and use those factors of production to produce goods and services. After that, they can sell those goods and services to households. Okay, so those are the two participants in the circular diagram. Now let's see the first one. We have two markets, okay, in the circular diagram. The first one will be markets for factors of production. So think about in this market, who is the provider? Who is the provider of factors of production? Definitely households, right? As I just talked about, household can offer the labor, can offer the land, offer capitals, right? So for household, they offer land capital, right? So the household offer factors of production to the firms. And then firms, they need to pay wages, pay the rents, okay, to the households, and that will become the income of household. So look at the circular diagram for this part, okay? Households and firms, they participate in the market of factors of production. So households offer land, capital, or labor to the firms, and firms pay wages and rent. That will become the income of households. Okay? Now we will talk about another market. That is the market for goods and services. So in this market, can you tell me who is the provider? As we just talked about before, firms or corporations, they will use the factors of production to produce goods and services, right? So households, they will buy goods and services, right? Households, they will buy and consume goods and services. And those expenditures from households will become revenue for firms, right? Because firms, they offer goods and services, and household buy those goods and services. So from this circular diagram, we show the GDP from different perspective. They can equal income, right? They also equal, the GDP can also equal spending, that is expenditure, will also equal revenue or equal what we say the output value. Okay, so from this circular diagram, we just simplified the macroeconomic in a very simple, in a very easy diagram. Okay, we assume there is only two participants, household and firms, only two markets, markets for the factors of production and markets for goods and services. So for this circular flow, let's see another simplified version. Household firms, you can see household offer, just think about offer labor to the firms. And the firms pay wages that will become the income for households. Households will spend money to buy goods and services, that is expenditure, right? And because firms will offer goods and services to households, okay? So what we'd like to see in this circular diagram, we mentioned there are only two participants, right? Firms and households. So we might dig a little bit more about what this diagram omits. So it will definitely omit an important part that is government. Okay. So for government, they will collect taxes and also government can also buy and consume goods and services. In this diagram, we didn't mention anything about a financial system, right? And we also didn't mention anything like the foreign department, right? So the foreign sector is also omit in this circular diagram. Therefore, I would like to say for the circular diagram, it is just very simple way to show you why the GDP will equal income, equal expenditure, and equal the output value. Now let's look at GDP, okay? So how do we measure GDP if we look at the production side? So here I would like to show you how we can measure GDP from production side. Now let's look at GDP definition one by one. GDP is the market value of all the final goods and services produced in a country for given periods of time. Okay, so here we'll say GDP is the market value of all the final goods and services produced in a country for a given periods of time. So GDP, we measure GDP in output value, not output quantity. Okay, it's the value. So how can we get a market value? It will equal to price times the quantity. So pay attention, GDP measures the value, the market value, not the market quantity, okay? So we use the quantity times the price to get a market value. So GDP is not sum of the quantity. We can see there is an example, okay? Suppose in 2010, United States produced 12 billion pizza pies. Also, US also produced 8 million cars. So from this quantity, it seems that pizza takes much, much more quantity, right? So if we just look at quantity produced, pizza pie seems more important to our GDP relative to cars, right? However, we should look at the market value, not quantity. Therefore, we can say that in 2010, if the market price for pizza is $5, then 12 billion pizza would worth like $60 billion, right? For cars, we know United States produce 8 million vehicles, and each vehicle, let's assume, is $30,000. So those cars were worth $240 billion. So you can see GDP is the market value. You need to sum the market value of these two products to get $300 billion as we counted in GDP. Now, let's look at GDP or goods and services measures in the same unit, for example, in dollars. There are other things that don't have the market value will be excluded. So for example, the housework that you do for yourself. If I at home I take care of my baby boy, then I don't need to pay the daycare fee, right? Because I did it by myself. But that type of the work will not count it in GDP. Illegal goods price will not count in GDP as well. Now let's look at the second important part about GDP. GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country within a given period of time. So, final goods. What is final goods? Final goods means they are the goods or services that are intended for the end user. So, for example, I use this pen. This is the final good. Okay. Compared to final goods, we might have intermediate goods. So intermediate goods, we just use them as a component or ingredients in the production of other goods. I will explain the intermediate goods later. So let's see. For intermediate goods, they are the goods that firms will repackage or bundled with other goods or services sold at a later stage. So for example, the milk sold to a coffee shop. The coffee shop might use the milk to produce latte, right? So if you consume latte, latte will be what we say the final goods because we are the end use of latte. You buy latte, you don't need to pay extra money for the milk that already added to it, right? Or like tires, we treat tires also as intermediate goods if the tires are sold to a car manufacturers to produce a car. When you pay for the vehicle, you already pay for the tires. You don't need to pay extra monies for those four tires that the car already have, right? So intermediate goods are the goods that the firms will repackage or bundled with other goods that will be sold at a later stage or will be sold to the end user. We can also see if I pay $500 or say $800 for iPhone, I don't need to pay extra money for the chip, right? Because $800 I paid for iPhone already include a chip inside the iPhone. So the chip has been repackaged in the iPhone. So for final goods, they are the goods sold to the final users or consumers. So to get an accurate GDP estimate and avoid double counting, so GDP only counts for final goods and services because they already included the value of the intermediate goods used in the production. Okay? So we will not count intermediate goods price if we already have the price for final goods. Now let's look at one example about value added or intermediate goods. A farmer grows a bushel of wheat and sells it to a miller for $1. The miller turns the wheat into flour and sells it to a baker for $3. Then the baker uses the flour to make a loaf of bread and sells to an engineer for $6. The engineer eats the bread. So look at this one. If I ask you, what is GDP based on this information? We need to compute the value added at each stage of production and then to find out the GDP. Or you can look at the end user. Who is the end user? The engineer is the end user, right? And how much you pay for that? You pay for $6 for the bread, right? So we would like to say in this case, $6 will be added into GDP. But we can also use the value added at each stage to verify our answer. So look at this one. When a farmer sold bushels of the wheat to the miller, he obtained $1, right? So the value added for the farmer will be $1, right? Because he sold the wheat to the miller. Then the miller turned the wheat into flour and sold it at $3 to a baker. So this is from farmer, okay? For the miller, can you tell me what's the value added? The miller spent $1 to buy the wheat, right? And then sold the flour at $3. So the meters actually, his value added is $2, right? And then finally, the baker used those flour to make bread and sells the bread at $6. So for baker, what's the value added? Finally, he obtained $6, but he also spent $3 to buy the flour. So the value added for baker is $3. Then you look at farmers value added $1, meters value added $2, and the baker's value added $3. So use $1 plus $2 plus $3. You can also get $6 will be added into GDP. And $6 actually is the price for bread. And bread is the final goods for engineer, right? Okay, so this is what we call about a value added, the final goods, and GDP. So GDP will equal to the value of all the final goods produced. It will also equal to the sum of the value added at all stage of production. The value of the final goods already including, you see the value of the final goods, $6 here, already includes the value of all intermediate goods. So including the intermediate goods price and the final goods price would be resulted in double counting in GDP. Okay, so we will only treat $6 in GDP. Okay. Now let's look at one practice question. One bag of oranges is sold at $6 to a company that turns them into juice, which is sold to a consumer at $12. Another bag of oranges is purchased by a grocery store for $6, who then sell it to consumers for $7. Taking these four transactions into account, how much is added to GDP? So the question for this one is to find out the end user. Who is the end user of those oranges? The first bag of the oranges, the end user is the consumer, right? $12. For the second bag, the end user is also the consumer. He spent $7. So how much? You use $12 from the first bag plus $7 for the second bag. Then you will get the answer equal $19. Option C is correct. Now let's look at another important things about GDP. So we talk about GDP should be the market value of all final goods and services. So GDP not only including goods, it also including services, right? So goods are tangible, like the food, clothing, cars, houses. Okay, those were put into good in goods category. We also have the services, right? Like teaching, education, healthcare. Those are what we said, the services. Okay, so those are intangible. Therefore, GDP including the market value of all final goods and services. In United States, you can see the consumption as a share of GDP from 1960 takes nearly 50%, but now consumption, including goods and services, takes more than 70% in our GDP. And then let's look at another part of GDP. It is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country, in a given period of time. So there is a boundary to compute GDP. Something produced in foreign countries cannot count it in our country's GDP, right? So GDP measures the value of production that occurs within a country's borders, whether done by its own citizen or by foreigner. Understand? If there is a people from Korea, okay, he work in United States, his income were counted in US GDP. Understand? So GDP only consider the things that produce within its country, okay, within its country borders, no matter the nationalities. So we can see there is example, Thomas, a US citizen, work only in Canada. The value of his output were counted in US GDP or not. It were not counted in US GDP, although he's a US citizen, but he worked in Canada, not in United States. Therefore, his earning, his income cannot count it in US GDP. It can count it in Canada's GDP, okay? So the final things about GDP would be it is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country within a certain period of time. So GDP has a time frame. GDP includes the currently produced goods and services, not the goods and services produced in the past. Because those goods produced in the past already including in the past GDP. So for example, I bought a second-hand car, a used car. The money that I spent on that used car cannot count it in this year's GDP because that car's value has already been counted in the year that it produced. Okay? So how do we measure GDP? So those are some informations. Okay, those are some informations about GDP. We talk about different perspectives. Okay, market value or final goods and services within a country for certain periods of time. Okay. Now let's look at how to measure GDP from a spending side. So GDP from spending side, we would like to talk about the Bureau of Labor Statistics, okay, or we say the Bureau of Economic Analysis, BEA, is the US government agency that will compute the GDP, okay? And this is the four components how the BEA compute GDP. So you can see here we have the GDP in four components, okay? C plus I plus G plus NX. I will explain those later, okay, one by one in details. What does those C, I, G, and NX represents for, okay? So C means consumption. I means investment. G is government spending, and NX means net export. Okay, so let's look at the first components. For consumption, consumption means the value of all goods and services bought by the households, including the durable goods for a long time, for certain periods of time, okay? Because like the cars, the house equipment, okay? It also including the non-durable goods such as the food, because it could be perishable, right? And then you're also including services. So you can see the consumption actually including goods consumption, services consumption, right? And for the goods consumption, you're also including durable goods consumption and non-durable goods consumption. So those are the components that can put into consumption. Let's look at investment. Pay attention, very careful. This investment is totally different from financial investment that you might be putting in your like your store market. Okay, this investment is GDP's investment, very different. Okay, so in GDP, investment including three components: business fixed investment, spending money on the plant or on the equipment; residential fixed investment. This residential fixed investment will be the spending on the new house or new apartment. The spending on the new house or new apartments. Then the third investment will be inventory investment. Okay? So you can see the investment in GDP was totally different from financial investment, including three components. Business fixed investment means the spending on the plant or new equipment, or residential fixed investment means the household spending on the new house or new land or new apartments. Inventory investment, okay, three components. So the investment doesn't include purchases of stock markets, the stocks or the bonds. Okay, that's totally different concept. Let's look at a practice question. James owns two houses. He rents one house to Johnson family for $10,000 per year. He lives in another house. If he were to rent the house in which he lived, he could earn $12,000 per year in rent. How much do the housing services provided by these two houses contribute to GDP? Okay, so Look at this one. James has two houses. One he now live by himself. Another he rent, right? So the rent 10,000 dollars can definitely count in GDP. However, for the second one, $12,000, that's something that James planned to do, but it hasn't been done yet, right? Therefore, $12,000 cannot count in GDP. Only $10,000, the rent, can count it in GDP. Okay? So that's the answers for this question. Another practice question. At the start of the year, Tom and Lily built a new house for $250,000. They believe they could rent it for $12,000 this year. How much does Tom and Lily's decision to buy the house and have it rented or changes yearly GDP? Okay, so look at this question. It will be different from previous one because Lily and Tom already they bought a house. So this is the new house, right? And then this contributes to investment, right? So $250,000 can definitely count it in GDP, okay? Because this part is residential fixed investment. So it contributes to investment. And then at the end of the question, it says, has it rented? Has it rented? So they bought this house and then they also rented. So the rent that they collected, $12,000, can also to be counted in GDP because this will be the rental services they provided, and this is belongs to consumption. Therefore, totally, their decision to buy the house and have it rented can contribute to GDP by, you need to sum these two and then to have totally, okay, totally will contribute to GDP by $262,000. Now let's look at this one. John buys a used car for 5,400 dollars and spends $600 on the new parts made in the United States to fix the car. The end result of these two transactions is, look at this one, which one could be correct? US consumption purchase increased by 5,400 or US GDP increased by 5,400. Option B, US consumption purchase increased by 6,000 and US GDP increased by 6,000. Option C, US consumption purchase increased by 600 and US GDP increased by 600. The last option, the US consumption increased by 600 and the US GDP increased by 6,000. Which one is correct? Look at this question. John buys a used car for 5,400. Can this part count it in this year's GDP? As I told you before, GDP only counted this year's production, not previous year's production. Okay? Therefore, $5,400 cannot count in GDP because this is a used car. Okay? However, after John purchased this car, he spent additional $600 for the new parts. For the new parts, right? This is for the new parts. And this parts made in the United States. Therefore, $600 can count it in GDP. And only GDP increased by $600. Okay, so option C is correct. Option C is correct. Now let's look at government purchase. For government purchase is the all spending on the goods and services purchased by government at the federal level, state level, and local level. Okay, so three level: state level, local level, and federal level. So government purchases including the government employee salaries, government buildings and equipment produced, like the public project infrastructures, like school, public schools, post office. Okay, all those were counted in government purchase. However, there is one thing important: do not count. Something cannot counted in government purchase will be transfer payments. Okay, this is also important. Transfer payments cannot counted in government purchase. So, for example, these years, some people might receive their COVID funds, right? The COVID relief, like the paycheck. So those is what we call the government transfer payment. But those transfer payments cannot counted in government purchase because when the people receive those paycheck, they already will spend those paycheck into the consumption, right? So that part money will already counted in consumption. Therefore, transfer payment, okay? Transfer payment cannot counted in government purchase. When the household spend those transfer payments, it will already enter GDP as part of consumption or investment. So transfer payments cannot double counted in government purchase. Now look at the last part, net exports. So we talk about net exports, okay? Net exports. So net exports will actually equal exports subtract imports. Exports were the value of the goods and services sold to other countries, and imports, on the contrary, it will be the value of the goods purchased from other countries. If if this one larger than zero, okay, if this one we said the exports larger than imports, we said the government now has trade surplus. This one is trade surplus. However, if this one less than zero, we will say the government will have trade deficit. Okay? Do you know the US will has a trade deficit or trade surplus? Net exports represent a small proportion in total GDP, and you know in the United States, actually we currently have a trade deficit. Okay? People complain about some people, some economists might complain about the trade deficit, but I leave the question for you. Is it really bad to have trade deficit? Is it really bad to have trade deficit? You can search those questions online, and then you will see there is a lot of people would have their arguments, okay, or discussions about trade deficit. Now let's see. In United States, since 2000, you can see from this graph, okay, from 2009, the orange line represents for import, okay? The blue line represents for exports, and the orange line is always above the blue line, which means the US always suffered a trade deficit in the past 20 years, okay? But it's not only in the past 20 years, okay? US always has trade deficit in the past at least 50 years. So for trade deficit, we have the imports, the orange line always above the blue line. Now, let's look at the GDP, okay? So GDP is an important and versatile concept. We talk about GDP in production side. We also talk about GDP in spending side, right? So we measure GDP in total income, in total output, in total expenditure, or the sum of the value added at all stage in the production of the final goods. And then GDP also have four components. Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. A very simple addition, okay? Four components. and then we have GDP. Now let's look at one practice question. Just look at one practice question. In each of the following cases, determine how much GDP and each of its components will be affected. Debbie spent $200 to buy a husband dinner at a finest restaurant in Boston. How does that will affect GDP? Debbie spent $200 to buy a fancy meal, okay, a dinner. So definitely consumption will increase $200, right? And GDP will also increase by $200. Nothing changes in investment, government spending, or net exports in this case. Next one. Sarah spent $1,800 on a new laptop from Best Buy to use in her publishing business. However, that laptop was built in China. So look at this one. This is for our first question. Now let's look at the second question. When Sarah spent $1,800 for a new laptop from Best Buy and then into her business, so which means she will spend the money for the business fixed investment, right? So investment, business fixed investment here will increase by $1,800. However, pay attention, it also mentioned this laptop was made in China, which means this one we have imported, right? So we net exports here should subtract $1,800, right? Because this laptop was made in China. Therefore, with these two parts, these two components, there is nothing changes in GDP, okay? There is nothing changes in GDP. Let's look at the last one. General Motors built a 500 million worth cars, but consumptions only buy 470 billion cars. Okay, so for this question, how can you solve? The first one we will see for GM. Okay, it builds 500 millions of the cars, $500 million. Okay, consumption only consume $470 million, right? And then the rest of the car will goes to inventory, right? So the inventory investment, this is what we say, inventory investment will increase by $30 million, will increase by $30 million. So totally adding these two parts, we can have the GDP actually increase by $500 million. Okay. Now let's look at the last practice questions about how to compute GDP. So this type of the table will show frequently in your practice question, in the weekly quizzes, or in your homework assignments. Okay. And then you can see from this one, it shows the table, okay, from different categories. And then the first one asks you to compute the consumption, and then the investment, government purchase, net exports, and finally GDP. Okay, so look at this question and look at this table together. So in this table, we would like to say we have their consumption. So do you remember when we talk about consumption, including so for consumption, consumption including two parts, right? Goods consumption, service consumption, right? Goods also including durable goods and non-durable goods. So look at this table. Which part can contribute? Household purchase of durable goods, right? So the durable goods will be $1,108. Household purchase of non-durable goods, $702. And then for the services, he says household has the non-educational service. Non-educational service is $203, and educational service $302. Okay, so adding those numbers together, then you can get consumption. Okay, adding those four numbers together, you can get consumption. Now let's look at investment. So for investment, as I told you before, including three parts, right? Business fixed investment. Business fixed investment. Business fixed investment including which parts? Let's see. Purchase of the new structures. Purchase of the new structures, 260. This one will be $267. Also including residential fixed investment. Residential fixed investment, always the things like the purchase of the new house. Let's see, purchase of the new house will be 816. And yes, so this one will be the residential fixed investment. But now look at the next one will be the purchase of a capital equipment, 333. So that part will also counted in business fixed investment. So 333 will be counted in business fixed investment as well. And then the last part of investment will be inventory, right? Inventory investment. In this case, it will be $75. Okay, so adding those four numbers together, you can also get the investment. And now we move on to government spending. So the government spending, as I told you before, including three level, right? State level, local level, and federal level, but don't count transfer payment. Okay, so what you need to do is to add those numbers together for the local, state, and federal government spending, but don't including transfer payment. Okay, and then the last part asks you to compute the net export. So net export will equal. So I'll write down things here. Okay, so for net export will equal export subtract imports. Okay, so you need to use 200 and let's see 217 subtract 129 to get the net exports. On government spending, I write down here, okay? You use the federal level plus the state level and the local level. Okay, so finally, you will get the four components of GDP, and then you can sum all those four components to get the GDP. Okay, so this is the way that we can solve for this type of the question.